It is early spring, in 1808. In the Danish city of Odense, a young boy strolls through the streets with his father. The boy is brimming with joy. His third birthday, April 2nd, is just days away, and the town is abuzz with the arrival of foreign soldiers. These strangers, with their distinctive uniforms and unfamiliar language, fascinate him. He doesn't fully understand who they are or why they are there, but his father, a local shoemaker, explains that the soldiers are from Spain, and they are not enemies. Curious, the boy's eye lock with one of the soldiers. The man smiles warmly, and in an instant they connect. The soldier lifts the boy into his arms, and for a brief moment, the two share a bond that transcends language and age. This fleeting yet profound encounter leaves a lasting imprint on the boy's memory. Years later, that little boy will grow up to become one of the world's most beloved storytellers, Hans Christian Andersen, and he will recall this moment as his earliest memory. But what was the Spanish soldiers doing all the way up on the Danish islands in 1808? To understand that, we must talk about this man, French Marshal Bernadotte. In 1808, Bernadotte was the French governor in Hamburg. In early February, he had gotten a letter from Marshal Berthier informing him of the upcoming Russian invasion of Sweden, scheduled to start at any moment. After the Peace of Tilsit, Napoleon had subdued all his major opponents on the European continent. Only the Swedish province of Stralsund remained on the European mainland. Stralsund had managed to stand up to and even chase away the French, while the Russians were still in the fight. For example, in April 1807, Hans von Essen and Gustav Armfelt had led a sortie out of Stralsund that had soundly defeated the French besieging force and chased them away. But after Tilsit was signed in the summer, Napoleon could concentrate enough forces that any further resistance was futile. In a clever move, Swedish Field Marshal Johan Christopher Tolb had told the French general in charge that the Swedish troops were fed up with the king, Gustav Adolf, and that they were ready to revolt if they got back home to Sweden proper. This was of course just a ruse, but the fact that the French general believed him should tell us something about the feelings in the Swedish army at the time towards the king. With this trickery, Tal saved the besieged army in Stralsund to fight another day. As Tal knew, Stralsund would not be the end of Napoleon's ambitions. In Tilsit, he and the Russian Tsar Alexander had agreed upon a plan that would involve a free-front invasion of Sweden. The Russians would invade Finland, and a coalition of French, Dutch, Spanish and Danish armies would invade Sweden proper from the Danish Isle and from Norway. It was this information that Bernadotte received in February of 1808, along with the orders to lead the coalition armies and prepare the invasion of Sweden. Bernadotte was instructed to lead 3 divisions, 1 Spanish, 1 Dutch and 1 French, of about in total 30,000 men, to Zealand, while the Danish themselves were to contribute about 12,000 additional forces. But when Bernadotte reached Denmark, the old king had just died, and the new king was not very keen on putting his forces under French command. For Napoleon this was all just fine. His main purpose was not really an invasion. He wanted the Russians to be preoccupied with the war, while he focused on his issues in Spain. But this information was not privy to Bernadotte, who, as with everything he did, took the assignment very seriously. Bernadotte drew up detailed plans on the invasion and made sure to know everything there was to know about Sweden. He had already met Swedish soldiers when he captured them after the Prussian collapse back in the autumn of 1806. He was also familiar with the Swede Claes Fredrik Horn, who had been involved in the assassination of King Gustav III, and who had fled to Hamburg afterwards. Horn gave Bernadotte detailed information about the situation in Sweden and which faction supported the king and who didn't. But in the end, none of this would matter because of events outside of Bernadotte's control. In May, Napoleon ended the Spanish monarchy, and a month later instead installed his brother on the throne. The situation in Spain would quickly spiral out of control, and in Denmark, Bernadotte stood with an army that was at least up to a third made up of Spanish soldiers. Bernadotte trusted the Spanish commander and kept working on his invasion plans, which kept getting delayed because of new orders from the emperor. In the Sound, between Denmark and Sweden, a large fleet from the Swedish ally, Britain, had now arrived. The morale in the army was also nearing a collapse. When the Spanish troops were forced to swear allegiance to their new French king, they responded with gunfire, and a French officer had been killed. On the 9th of August, Bernadotte was informed that the Spanish troops had switched sides. With the help of a Scottish priest, who acted as an agent in Denmark, the Spaniards had planned their escape, with the help of the British fleet. When Bernadotte realized what had happened, it was already too late. The Spaniards had moved over to another island, and the French could not follow, due to the British Navy. From there, they were first moved to Sweden, and then taken by the British back to Spain, to fight in the Peninsular War. The only thing that Bernadotte's army would ever get into Sweden were some propaganda pamphlets that were written by another Swede in exile, Carl Fredrik Ehrensvärd, who had also been involved in the assassination of Gustav III and now lived in Copenhagen. The letters were sent by balloons from Zealand over the Sound to Sweden, but were easily handled by Toll, who collected them all and burned them. So, for Sweden, this was a thrilling moment in history when nothing happened, at least not a French invasion of Sweden, although it did fulfill its purpose in binding Swedish troops in the west, keeping them from fighting the Russians in the east. But let's talk about that another time. As to what happened to Bernadotte, as we all know, he would go on to have more to do with Sweden in the future. Historian Herman Lindqvist writes this about the invasion that never happened. Afterwards, Bernadotte faced Napoleon's wrath. All blame was placed on the Marshal. The Emperor had completely forgotten that it was on his orders that the Spaniards had been stationed on the isolated islands, thereby facilitating the English in making contact with them and taking them away. It was Berthier's directive that Bernadotte himself should have his headquarters in Holstein, far from the Spaniards, and both Napoleon and Berthier had kept the seriousness of the uprising in Spain hidden from Bernadotte for far too long.